I'm somebody who's always liked computer games. I'm exactly the right age to be at the forefront of the computer gaming revolution. When I was at primary school, we had these little handheld devices with a little LED screen on, where you could have a character jumping between ivy leaves to dodge things coming at it. And it'd have about 10 levels or something like that. And the levels would get progressively harder, and you wouldn't necessarily complete the game, you'd just go as far as you could before it got too insanely difficult. And of course that was the original Mario game, Donkey Kong. There were lots of games like that really, like Pac-Man and Space Invaders and Tetris, and there was lots of variations on a theme, asteroids, frack, and what have you. And the concept will be quite simple. Each level would just get progressively harder and levels went by quite quickly, but they would be challenging and interesting. The problem with those early games is they don't last very long. Once you'd got to Space Invaders level whatever you got to, you tended to always die at the same spot. And it didn't take very long to get there. So it was more a case of having lots and lots of, I suppose, little games. And these are the kind of games that you can pick up and play for a bit until you get to the point where you always die, and then put it down again and you've had your fix and that's job done. But as I got older and into secondary school, that's when they started bringing out all the a bit more involving games, like Super Mario, where you've got lots and lots of levels where it is all completable if you just get a little bit better each time. I suppose they started becoming real computer games in that they had like a beginning and an end, and I suppose some kind of vague plot, and they were designed so that you could complete them. They weren't just getting infinitely more difficult. Sort of a world to escape in, I suppose. But not just a world to escape in, there was still the sense of improvement, the sense that you were using your skills to beat the game. However, at this point in time, consoles were more enjoyable because, weirdly enough, it was the consoles that had the better graphics. And I don't mean in pixel count or anything like that, because, you know, there were PC games being made that had good pixel counts and good polygon counts and all that kind of thing. But the controls for them were so obscure that you needed to read a 200-page manual to get into them. Whereas the console games looked interesting and pretty, and you didn't need a 200-page manual to get into them. In the late 90s, as I started getting into my late teens, early 20s, the PC gaming market really took off, and you actually started getting PC games that looked pretty and were interesting and were good games, and they were being made at a decent budget. And it was at this point that sort of like PC games started to become a lot more interesting than console games. The problem with console games is they still had this sort of arcadey aspect where once you'd played it for, I don't know, 2 or 3 days or whatever, once you'd mastered it, that was pretty much it. You're kind of done with it, and didn't necessarily stick in your mind as a great experience. It was still sort of scratching the itch, but not necessarily giving you that full experience of an immersive computer game. I don't want to get too much into a console versus PC debate here, just giving my own experiences, because I know that there were some games back then that would have been on both systems, and you can get all kinds of pedantic arguments about what makes a console game and what makes a PC game and all that kind of thing. You know, for example, I bought Monopoly on a console, to play on a console game, PS1, and it was awful. The AI was ridiculously easy. It was absolutely pointless playing it. You know, you won the first game on the hardest difficulty, if it even had difficulty, I can't remember, and then that was it, that was game done. And similarly, when I bought Risk for the PC around the same time, again, they got most of it right, but the AI was so ridiculously easy that it was pointless playing. And that was generally the problem with most computer games back then, is that there was this problem that games were either too easy or too hard, or they were too easy to begin with and then got too hard very quickly. You think of the big titles of today like Grand Theft Auto that have people addicted for years, but you go back to the original Grand Theft Auto when it was released, and people have nostalgic memories, but it's not necessarily a game people could play for years, because it was very limited, and difficulty was a big issue back then, and the concept of obtuseness was very prevalent, and this obtuseness often stemmed from technological limitations and inexperience, and it was quite a new industry. Most people were just chucking things at the wall and seeing if they would stick. But it was really sort of in the mid-90s and onwards that the combination of decent graphics, the ability to get into the game without a massive manual, and a sense of immersion really came together, and you started getting titles that people still remember fondly, and titles that would continue to create more and more versions of themselves over the years. So things like Doom and Fallout and Baldur's Gate, and I suppose the original Grand Theft Auto in a way, and Anno, and lots of game series, Civilization. I could reel off lots and lots of, big name computer games, Championship Manager, whatever it's called now, and all its variations. They all came out at the sort of started their life at the same kind of time when the computing power was about right, a sweet spot as it were. And you can go back and play most of these games now and still find enjoyment in them. They don't necessarily feel ultra dated. I mean, they do feel dated obviously, but they don't feel like you're going into computer game archaeology like you are with MS-DOS or the original console games, or like ET or whatever, and all that kind of thing. I consider this sweet spot a golden age of gaming, a golden age of computer gaming, because they were still games. You had immersive and interesting worlds that you could play again and again, but they were still games. Take something like Myth: The Fallen Lords. You don't hear much about that anymore, but that was a great game when that came out. Anybody who played and remembered that will always have give a positive review of it. And that was just a little combat game where these little sprites fought ever more complex other sprites in little on-field battles, little scenarios. And while Myth didn't go on to be a consistent name, other games that used a sort of similar technique did, like, for example, Total War. Again, that's where you have lots of sprites engaging in combat over more and more difficult scenarios. But a game like Baldur's Gate as well, you have like little sprites engaging in battles and ever more complex scenarios. But you now have more engaging plots behind them and interactions between the sprites, and all this kind of thing, creating all this lovely world. And the art that they put these sprites in, the backgrounds, became really nice, really visually pleasing. And games like Baldur's Gate and the Annos and Civilization, and they would all have good budgets behind them. They would all be sort of categorised in what would be the modern terminology of AAA. You'd go into the game shop and they would be there promoted as the hot new releases, as it were, and they'd stay on the shelves for months and people would buy them. They'd be in the top 40 and all that. But they'd only be developed by about 30 people. The actual development, we're talking about teams that weren't massively huge. We're not talking about skyscrapers full of people bringing you the latest masterpiece. We're at that sort of sweet spot of middle-sized development, of people just producing games in a genre that they're interested in. As we move into 2005, the budget started ballooning. As computer gaming became more and more popular, more and more people engaging in that as an activity, the budgets for the games started increasing exponentially, and games started becoming big. One of the first early examples of this might be something like Oblivion, where Morrowind was kind of a popular but niche game. Oblivion was sort of like a game everybody was supposed to play. And back then everything, before Oblivion, everything was sort of a popular but niche game. For example, I never played the original Grand Theft Auto, that just wasn't in my wheelhouse. And I didn't play Morrowind because that wasn't in my wheelhouse. But when Oblivion came along, it was so big. It represented the beginning of the big game, as it were. the game where they spend so much money on it that it has to be successful, it's sort of too big to fail. You're no longer just chucking things at the wall and seeing what sticks and doing what you enjoy and hoping it becomes popular. But you're now like spending so much money on it that you have to manufacture a product that is almost guaranteed to make money. You have to please as many people as possible. And so from then on, all the AAA games, as it were, all the games that would dominate the space on the shelves, all started being very similar in that they then started going down the simulation route. The primary interest for the player was the simulation, not the game. Things like mechanics sort of fall by the wayside, as it were. And what's more important is that the player just keeps moving their character around in this world, engaging with things to keep them occupied. They're not necessarily difficult things or interesting things, or there's any kind of scaling of difficulty throughout the game. It's just keeping that person occupied in this world and simulation. Of course, The Sims, that was coming out at this time as well, and people trying to promote VR, of course, would try and put you in the world. And the concept of simulation is very much, it could be first person or it could be third person, it's much of a muchness. And you know, whatever the genre is, you're just this person going through the world, probably involving some form of combat at some point, but combat is just blasting a gun at something and hoping it hits, you know. So like the lines between genres just get very blurred because whatever genre you're interested in, it's now been converted into a first or third person shooter effectively. You might not necessarily have a gun, you might have a sword. You might not necessarily have a gun or a sword, but you've got some kind of gadget that enables you to pick things up and move them around to get through the game. And it's, you know, it's all kind of the same kind of genre, as it were. Whereas sort of like prior to Oblivion, I don't know, it was kind of more sprite based, I suppose, if that's the right way to describe it. Or there was more sprite based games around, and I think, of course, Doom was a first person shooter, and that was going back a bit, but the original Doom wasn't really about exploring the world as such. It's difficult to put into words these kinds of things because people haven't really found words for them yet. But Doom feels like a computer game in that the things you encounter are challenges that you have to get over. You're not necessarily there for the lore as much as you're there for completing the game. The fact that it has some lore and it's quite an engaging world is like a bonus on top. Whereas you fast forward 10 years and it's reversing, in that the lore and the world is more important than the game. And for a lot of people, obviously, this isn't a problem. A lot of people kind of prefer this in a way. You know, it's almost a different genre completely. It's people talk about computer games as if they're all one big homogeneous blob, when they're not really. And there's lots of different things you can find in computer games, and different things you're getting out of it, and different reasons for playing them. But the word game itself has sort of gone by the wayside. It's more like simulations now, more simulated experiences. And I always quite liked the game aspects, really. That was why I played computer games. It was for the game aspect, to challenge my brain against whatever is being put in front of me to overcome. The idea of wandering around an artificial world, engaging in endless conversations with NPCs, it's not something that interests me in the slightest, really. Not unless those conversations have some kind of correlation to the game aspect, like you might find in a Nancy Drew game when you have conversations with NPCs. It's to advance the plot or to find out clues. But in a simulation game, very often the NPC is just there to create a world, create the movie, as it were, enhance realism or give the player activities. I'm playing Baldur's Gate 3 at the moment, and that has an awful lot of dialogue in it, and I'm sure some dialogues are connected here and there, but an awful lot of it is just flavour text. And I like the RPG genre a lot. It's one of my favourite genres, but it really breaks my balls when you spend the whole game just chatting to NPCs and nothing. There doesn't seem to be any game there. It's just sort of immersing yourself in a fantasy world because you want to immerse yourself in a fantasy world. And if I wanted to do that, I'd read a book or watch a movie. You know, I'm one of those people. To conclude, what I'm getting at, what the problem is that sweet spot that I mentioned, what I called the golden age of computer gaming, where there seemed to be exactly the right balance between all these different aspects that could be in a computer game. Well, that's such a sweet spot. The games just seemed perfect. They obviously weren't perfect. You know, we moaned about things at the time and things that could have been improved or all that kind of thing. And they probably had bugs, and they did have bugs and all that kind of stuff. But I'm not talking about that kind of perfection. And graphics can always be improved, of course, and etc. But what I'm talking about is just the perfect balance of ingredients of what made the computer game. If you spoke to an NPC, it didn't wear you out. You weren't like worn out by NPCs necessarily. Combat was always interesting with good varieties of encounters. They put a lot of thought into what kind of encounter you might experience. And, like in the Civilization games, for example, in the earlier games, all the different. This is a sort of good metaphor for the whole process, really. In the early Civilization games, Civilization 2, you could work any tile. And later on in the game, you could terraform any tile. So if you know these games, you know what I'm on about. If you don't, just bear with me for a minute. But like, they're set out in squares, and on this square you could build a road, then later build a railroad on it. Or you could build a farm and then later irrigate that farmland. And then later on in the game, you could turn it into a lake, or you could turn it into the sea. Or you could turn it into a hill or a mountain. You could do anything you wanted with that piece of land, as it were, that bit of territory in your territory. But then in Civ 3, all of a sudden you can't do so much with mountains. You're not allowed to, and you can't terraform anything anymore. You can't convert your grassland into a mountain. And you can't build your city on a mountain. You could build your city on a mountain in Civ 2, you can't in Civ 3. And then in Civilization 4, as we're getting into this, as I say, this sort of 10-year flip, you can't do anything with mountains anymore. In Civilization 4, mountains are just bits of pointless land that irritate you, really. And it's this kind of, it feels like a disimprovement while the graphics are getting nicer, if you know what I mean. The things you can do in the game to make it a game are being reduced to make it look prettier and provide a more simulated experience as opposed to a gamified experience. Because of course in reality, you probably wouldn't turn your mountain into a grassland. But in a computer game, that's just gamification. You could pick up and play vast numbers of games between 1995 and 2005 where you're playing a computer game and that the mechanics are interesting and the world is pretty and it's engaging. Lots of replayability there depending on which particular mechanics you choose to favour. But as the budget's increased and all the mechanics get sort of like pushed to the sidelines, you have these the shelf space for people's attention, is dominated by these big budget games, and if you go online to Steam or whatever, you can find lots of small developers, independents, making very small games that have graphics that are worse than they were in the year 2000, less interesting graphics, but they're often made by like one or two people, and so and they're classed as independent. You've got massive games and tiny games, but what tends to be missing from the market is this sweet spot where you have about 20 or 30 people making a good quality, visually appealing game that's very immersive about something they actually want to make, that they're interested in themselves, that is a good combination of gamification and simulated world. That's what I miss in gaming. I wish there was more games like that. You still find them occasionally, but they're not coming out of America. Like, for example, Baldur's Gate 3 was by Larian, who are in Belgium, of course. And the Pathfinder games, they're coming out of Russia, of course, and Eastern Europe generally. There's nice games like that coming out of Eastern Europe. But America, I mean, there's Obsidian tried with Pillars of Eternity, but you could kind of feel that maybe that's not what they were fully interested in. That the games didn't feel... They were good games, they sort of fulfilled what I'm talking about, but you didn't necessarily get a sense that they were trying to make what they were really interested in. And you can see in a lot of their modern games and their historical games that they are more interested in making like the third person or first person immersive sim type games. Probably wasn't their wheelhouse to make that sort of personal to them game, as it were. They tried with Tyranny. They were claiming that Tyranny was sort of like their personal to them game, and that was, I mean, it was all right, but it was kind of unfinished, and it didn't really, again, it didn't feel like it was somebody's put their heart and soul into it, if that makes sense. It didn't feel uniquely interesting, or where it was uniquely interesting, it wasn't conveyed in an interesting manner. And I don't want to offend the people who really like that game. I'm just trying to get a general point across. That I think this is where the current gaming market is missing a crucial element, as it were. That the middle ground has been lost. When you go shopping for a new game, you can either find this this huge pile of independent games of individuals trying to make good games and hope they get noticed. Like I recently played Caves of Lore, or Vampire Survivors, all that kind of thing, and it's all like graphics go by the wayside. We're just making a computer game, and small development team, big popularity, whatever, Caves of Quad, all that kind of thing. Or you can go to the massive billion-dollar game like Red Dead Redemption, whatever it's called, or the latest Grand Theft Auto, or the Bethesda Fallouts, or whatever, Starfield and all that. It's like big, and big but soulless, big but soulless. Ideally, what I'm looking for when I go shopping is like that middle category, just where you've got enough people to make a decent, pretty game that combines the gamification with the simulation in something they actually enjoy making, and you can sense they're enjoying making it from playing it. That sense of the solo or small team development, that sense of enthusiasm, combined with enough money and enough talent to put together something that is just really lovely. I'd be delighted if people can put in the comments, if anybody on the planet ever watches this, games that fall into the kind of thing that I'm talking about. Recommend me games that I might have missed, because another problem is that if a game like this does come out, how do I find it? How do I know it exists? Because it won't have enough money to advertise itself to me, because all the billion-dollar games are busy making sure I'm aware of them, using up all my time to say, no, buy me. And the little ones, you just ignore them until the word of mouth gets so big that it's sort of like, oh yeah, everyone said that's good, and somehow it's managed to rise to the top. It's got, you know, it's found the cream, it's risen to the top. Yeah, I'll give that a go. I don't know what percentage of independent games reach that, but I managed to find enough that I still play a lot of independent games. But that middle bracket, so hard to find. They've got to try and earn enough money to make millions in return, but somehow not spend 20 billion on marketing. But yeah, if you know of games that fall into this category, whatever the genre, you know, just let me know about them and I'll have a look at them, and maybe I'll talk about them in the future if I ever get the time to play them.